Thank you. Again, welcome to everybody joining us for this afternoon's session of SCTS Days 2024, Day 2. I'm here to introduce our first of two afternoon panels. This is Getting Up and Running with Alma Acquisitions, Tips, Tricks, and Lessons Learned. Presenting will be Karen Yavorsik, Caroline Royal, and Rachel Davis. And with that, I will turn it over for now to you two.
Great. Rachel should be joining us shortly. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. All right. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Great. All right. Well, thank you for joining us for our presentation on getting up and running with Alma Acquisitions, tips, tricks, and lessons learned. I'm Karen Yavorsik. I'm the Collections Management and Strategic Assessment Librarian at Oregon Health and Science University Library. And I'm joined by our wonderful collections team, Caroline Royal, our Acquisitions and Technical Services Coordinator, and Rachel Davis, our e-resources specialist, who is trying to get in right now, she told me. So hopefully she'll join us shortly here. All right, so just a little bit of background on what we're going to be talking about today. Our unit has experienced a lot of transition in the past few years. So I'm new to the management role for this unit, and all of us are in sort of new or expanded roles. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to experiment with some new processes. So we had never fully utilized the Alma acquisitions module. And one of the things that I really wanted to explore was how we might be able to use it to make our workflows more efficient, our reporting easier, and just generally better understand our collection. So I want to note at the outset that this is still very much a work in progress. So the Alma acquisitions documentation is really robust. But sometimes it can be hard to figure out exactly how to apply it in your library, especially if some of the data in your acquisition system is in various states of messiness, which ours definitely was. So I know that I would have appreciated when we began this work, the opportunity to see how more different libraries approached this work. So I hope that seeing what we did is helpful. All right, do we have Rachel on board yet?
I do not believe so.
Okay, well, I will get started with this piece then. So for how we started out, the previous state of our acquisitions module. So we had set up electronic data interchange with Gobi and with Harasowitz. So we had orders going out. We were able to do orders in Alma, and that was the main thing that we were using the acquisitions module for. So we...
Rachel has arrived.
Oh, great. Rachel, do you want to take over?
Sure, where are we at? Oh, the previous state. Yes. Okay.
So if you just want to start at the beginning of your section, great.
Yeah. So as Karen was letting you know, I am going to be taking you through the previous state of the acquisitions process at OHSU. So we had an electronic data interchange, or EDI, that had been set up to send purchase orders to Gobi. It was also set up to receive invoices back from both Gobi and Harasowitz, but we didn't have any workflows in place to do anything with these ingested invoices. We also didn't really process the purchase orders after they got sent out. So while there was a workflow in place to record non-Gobi orders manually, after some staff turnover, this wasn't prioritized. Also, mostly the tracking and processing was done outside of Alma, so it wasn't really necessary to be super tidy. So when Karen came on as department head, she really wanted to use the acquisitions model for tracking and finances, but because we never used it for that, our Alma acquisitions info was like the exploding file cabinet you saw earlier with lots of items coming in, but not being organized. So a lot of the work that they will be talking about today came from their hard work and investigation, so we could be more efficient at our jobs and really dig into the system. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned in previously, we had an EDI set up to get those invoices from Gobi into Alma, but we did very little with them in terms of processing, if at all. On top of this, when we migrated from Millennium to Alma, thousands of PO lines were imported, but never attached to any inventory, which Karen will explain more in detail later on. Next slide, please. So finally, the funds and ledgers were only used to the extent to make ordering function in Alma. Again, this was not an issue because we were not tracking finances in Alma, and the only real time we looked at them was when we rolled over to a new fiscal year. So now I'm going to hand you back to Karen, and she's going to talk to you about the state that we would like to see the Alma acquisition system be in at OHSU.
Got to unmute myself before I start talking. So this, our desired state is to kind of go from the sort of exploding file cabinet to a neat and tidy file cabinet where we have all of the, where we can find everything we want within the Alma system. So ideally, we'd like all the collections purchasing to be tracked in Alma so that we're not, you know, trying to look up in Gobi and Harassowitz and a lot of different emails or spreadsheets, all of it's in one place. We want order statuses to reflect actual actions that need to be taken. So as Caroline will talk a little bit more about later, we had a lot of orders that were in claim, even though we had received the book or we had activated the electronic resource, because we didn't process the orders after they went out, at least not in the acquisitions module. So we wanted to be able to actually use the workflow steps that Alma has created. We wanted the funds to reflect our actual budgets so that they would be useful for tracking purposes and not just be a function of being able to make an order. We wanted to be able to trust the data that came out of analytics reports. One of the first things that questions that I was asked when I came on involved pulling some information in analytics around textbooks that had been purchased. And because the orders weren't even necessarily attached to the information I was trying to pull in analytics, I wasn't able to pull a useful report in that way. I had to track down that information in other places. So we wanted to know what information we could trust about, you know, in analytics reports and be able to pull useful reports using PO lines and invoices and things like that. And we wanted to be able to easily understand how items in the catalog were purchased. So if we have orders but they're not attached to inventory, they're not useful if we're trying to track down, oh, well, why do we have access to this thing? And, you know, we have to be able to it's more complicated to pull that information. So that's where we're trying to get. And so I'm going to hand it over to Caroline to talk a little bit about how our plans for getting from the previous state to the current state, or the desired state at least.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, so we just really needed to think about a few different aspects of acquisitions. First off, we wanted to understand how the Alma acquisitions worked as a whole system. And a second very important detail was the way external systems in our Alma interact. Then we wanted to create a processing plan for legacy data already in the system. And finally, we wanted to devise new structures and workflows that reflect the needs and improve efficiency and the needs of the library and improve efficiency and accuracy. Next slide. So Alma as a system, there are certain tools that I'm sure many of you are familiar with to manage the acquisitions workflow. The top graphic is found under the Acquisitions All PO Lines tab, and those are the workflow steps. Below is the claims information, And below that section, there are alerts. So this is a really useful tool for finding information, managing your workflows, and so forth. The next thing that's offered is the task list widget in the center there. You can attach that to your Alma home screen and manage order lines, electronic resources, and invoices really easily from there. And finally, analytics reports. Occasionally, or maybe frequently, you'll run into situations that you didn't realize might happen. And when you find those, you find one. And if you go searching, you often find a variety of those. So you can create an analytics report that looks for that specific thing and make a widget out of it and then attach it to your Alma home screen. And so in this case, this one finds discrepancies between the PO line price and the invoice price, which is not a problem for encumbrances, but if we want our data to be accurate, then those things should be fixed. Next. So Alma and external systems, as Rachel mentioned, for ordering, where are the orders placed and how do they move between Alma and the supplier? So at OHSU, we don't have any selectors, and we don't have a lot of orders coming in. So we order from Alma and then send it to Gobi. Invoices, as Rachel mentioned, go in the other direction. So they come into our system, but not all of them. So we just needed to know which ones and what do we need to do manually. And another thing that's really shaped the way we do acquisitions is in the realm of activation. So we have auto holdings collections set up where things are automatically activated, but not for all collections. So we have kind of a branch structure in our workflow there when it comes to activating e-resources. Next. So our data cleanup plan. We needed to clean up legacy data. I think Katie yesterday mentioned how grateful she was that her PO lines were neat and tidy, but ours were not neat and tidy for historical reasons. And so we decided to go with a restart date, just because there was too much to clean up. So the beginning of fiscal year 24 was our restart date. And given that, we just determined FY24 is going to be fixed. Anything that's not correct, but anything before that, we don't need to bother with. And just a little tip that if you have a lot of legacy data that you want, POLs that you want put into closed, Ex Libris can do that for you. And then the third category is there's some data that you might not need to clean up right away, but you want to clean up at a later date, or maybe you don't have time to investigate this. Why is the data the way it is? So you can also set aside a category of things to be done later. Next. And then you want to think about workflows so that you don't reintroduce problems into the database. How are order lines created? How do you do receiving and activation? How do you do invoicing? And so templates can promote accuracy and save you time in templates for POLs and invoices. And then, of course, a fund structure that supports the library financing and institution financing and the reporting needs. Next. And these are a little list of kind of acquisitions adjacent items. Purchase requests. How do you receive purchase requests? So Alma has a purchase request workflow that you can use. Do people email you? Do people go on to Gobi and do selecting there? There are quite a few options, so that's good to consider for workflow reasons. How to document purchase reasons and requests in your POLs, and how to handle user and staff notifications. A system of reporting codes. So there's been a lot of talk around reporting codes. We only use 2 currently, but that's another thing that we're going to think about a little bit more. And something that's very important to us is being able to differentiate between subscribed and purchased electronic resources. And so we really still are considering how to track this best. And now I'll hand it back to Karen.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to, now that we've gotten sort of the overview of sort of how we approach this work, I wanted to talk about, some of the specific projects and actions that we took around doing the cleanup and establishing some new procedures for the way we were going to handle this data. The first thing I wanted to mention is funds and ledgers, because they are the first thing that you need to set up basically before you can do anything else in Alma acquisitions. You can't save an order line unless you have a fund set up to attach it to. So these for us were previously structured by the material and the purchase type. So like ebook package purchases was a fund, and print one-time orders was a fund, that sort of thing. And they also weren't allocated in any way. So we just sort of drew down from zero. There was no limit on like over encumbrances or over expenditures, because we weren't using it for tracking purposes. We were just using it to make those orders. When we were thinking about, how do we really want to be able to report on this going forward, one of the things that I especially wanted to be able to see was deposit versus non-deposit funds. So we do the majority of our ordering via Gobi for books and via Harassowitz for subscriptions, but we do have some things that we order from other places, and those can often be more difficult to track down information on, or sort of track down, because it's in so many different places. So, or different spreadsheets or things like that. So having the funds be able to help us track that was really helpful. And then one other thing that I wanted to note for if you are doing any sort of cleanup on legacy data is that you might need to extend your active period for old funds. So you have the option to have this grace period at the end of a fund. And like normally it might be for like, if you have invoices or orders that you're cleaning up just in the last, the first 30 days of the new fiscal year or something like that. But for us, if we're in 2024 cleaning up some data that might have been from 2021 to kind of do practice or anything like that, we had to make ours very long. So that's just something to keep in mind if you have to do any cleanup projects that involved old funds. If you're not seeing the fund as an option to assign things to, you might need to extend that period. All right, so one of the next things that I wanted to approach was subscriptions specifically, because it wasn't something that we had been tracking in any meaningful way in the acquisitions module. So we had these POLs that had been imported from a previous system, but they weren't attached to anything. So I kind of thought of them as ghost POLs, which is appropriate given that we're in spooky season right now. But you can see this is a screenshot. We have the PO line information, but there's no portfolio underneath it. So we did have a tracking spreadsheet for our subscriptions. And so what I did was go through that and make sure that everything either got attached to an existing POL or had a new one created. Looking back, I kind of wish I had approached it a different way. Starting from scratch probably would have been a lot easier. The POLs themselves, even though they already existed, needed a fair bit of cleanup. Like, for example, some of them were attached to print bib records instead of e-bib records. It would have, I think, saved some time to start from scratch rather than trying to attach them to things that were in the system and just get all the old ones closed out and start afresh. I did want to note that I was not able to find like a lot of documentation on creating orders for something that already exists in your catalog. I had asked Ex Libris about this and they're like, well, why would you want to do that? And the main reason is that, of course, that, we wanted to create a record of the orders so that we could track the funds and the spending for current subscriptions, even though they weren't recorded at the time of order, or they weren't recorded in the way that Alma expects in the time of order, at least. But you can do that if you order from the existing portfolio in your institution zone. It won't create like additional inventory or anything like that. You'll just be able to create an order as normal and proceed with having the record in your system. So, and then one other challenge, it was what I call mini packages. I'm not sure if there's a technical term for them, but they're sort of collections of subscriptions where it's something where we're buying like a very small package. So it's in the example pictured here, it's one journal that comes in 9 sections, and each one has its own portfolio. So with Alma, you can only create a PO line directly for a single portfolio or a single electronic collection. And so these sorts of things where we pay for a group of portfolios at a single price, a little bit more challenging to deal with. And the main way that we approached that was using technical PO lines. And the difference between that and like the usual sort of a PO line is that a technical PO line can have an amount of 0 and like a price amount. And then you can associate it with whatever PO line has the actual spending on it. And so you can do it either where you attach the full spend to a single portfolio and then associate the other portfolios, or you can create it as an other service. So an other service is the only kind of PO line that doesn't have to be attached to inventory. And then you can associate the technical PO lines that way. Depending on how your collection is organized, you may want to create a separate electronic collection for these. We keep most of our journals in auto holdings collections based on the publisher, for at least for the major publishers. And so in those cases, you know, having a separate electronic collection would have created a lot of unnecessary duplication. So we didn't use that solution, but that's one thing you can explore. You can also attach multiple portfolios to the same POL. This is not something I recommend doing because it makes Alma very, very confused, especially if you try to do any sort of reporting on it. The reports will be wrong, but it will allow you to do that. So if you want to explore that option, you can. It definitely did not work for the way we wanted to record this information. The last thing I wanted to note is that this year we're currently working on developing and refining workflows specifically around transfers and cancellations. So last year we were really focused on getting this information correct and accurate in the system, like making sure that everything had a PO line. And this year we are doing a little more canceling than usual because we did get a pretty significant budget cut to our collections budget. So it's a good opportunity for us to sort of make notes around like how do we close PO lines or open new ones if there's a transfer or something like that. How do we create e-activation tasks and adjust coverage or perpetual coverage as necessary? All right, so I'm going to pass it over to Rachel to talk about invoice.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, so insights about invoicing. So the first being, even if you don't use Alma to keep track of your finances like we used to, it's still super important that orders have an associated invoice because it's key for many of the reporting functions in Alma, like being able to measure the cost usage for e-inventory. And also many of the measures in the funds expenditure subject area rely on these invoices. Next slide, please. So here are some lessons that we've learned about invoicing along our journey. So help yourself by reducing clicks in your workflow by changing the default payment to deposit account. You can also remove barriers like approval threshold. Since the vast majority of our resources are paid for via Gobi or Harasowitz deposit accounts, as Karen was mentioning earlier, this allows us to just check the prepay box, which closes the invoice immediately after it's been reviewed, rather than having to go back in and enter the payment information. So now I'm going to hand you back off to Caroline, who's going to talk to you about cleaning up order lines.
Yeah, so I think maybe I want to mention ahead of time that I came to OHSU last December from a cataloging position. So acquisitions was pretty new to me. And it was really important for me to use the workflow steps because there's a lot of incoming and outgoing things, which is a little different than when you're cataloging stuff. So, having access to the workflow steps and the task list were really important to me, and those needed to be cleaned up. I kind of chunked the cleanup into batches of similar items, just kind of for efficiency of work, and you could get yourself into a routine and then do one right after the other. And the big areas were claims, invoices, the workflow step, waiting for invoice, and sent. And since we had a restart date of FY24, we had a whole bunch of PO lines for electronic and print resources that we were not going to rely on for data. So I used those to experiment and really to learn and understand how all the parts of acquisitions fit together. Next. So cleaning up, the first thing I worked on were claims. I think Rachel mentioned this earlier, but a lot of items had already been in use in the library. They were brought in and not received through Alma. So I wanted to manually process all the ones from fiscal year 24 and maybe a few more recent FY23 items in certain collecting areas for us. And the way I did that basically was to look for signs that they had been used, check the item record, were there loans on those, had someone put them onto course reserves and taken them off. I think I probably could have automated some of that with some analytics reports or something just to get a list of which ones had loans or something. But I appreciated doing this manually because, like I mentioned before, it really helped me understand the system. So if I did find the item had some use, then I just received it here in the receiving module of Alma, and that moved the items out of claim and into waiting for invoice or closed if the item had already been invoiced. Next. For electronic resources, the kind of counterpart to receiving is activating. That's how you get stuff out of claim or out of sent into the next workflow step. And basically, I did the same thing. I just checked, do we have access to this resource? If so, then I needed to activate it, because if you looked in the catalog, these resources were available. They were in available status. They had a green dot, and there was no way to get them out of claim except for to create an e-activation task, which you can see on the graphic there. That's from the portfolio. So you go to the portfolio, more actions, create an e-activation task, then you can go to the task list and activate from there, and that moves them out of this claim stage. Next. And then after all of the FY24 and some FY23 items, there were still 1,200 legacy items in claim, which we were not going to process. And so I filed a case with Ex Libris, and they were happy to send those to closed, and it took about 3 weeks. Next. So after taking care of all the claims, then I moved on to the invoices. Our invoices come in through an EDI automatically. So there were about 600 of them from Gobi sitting there. This is all for one-time purchases, so I didn't have to worry about the harassments ones. And you could get them easily from the task list under review without assignment. It's also very easy to find the accounting documents in Gobi, so I processed all of these regardless of whether they were FY24 or not. It was something I did in the last 20 minutes of the day. You could knock out 20 or 30 of them in 15 or 20 minutes and in between or whatever, and that went very quickly. And then after that, those items went to the workflow step closed. Next. So after the invoices, then there were still some items in the workflow step waiting for invoice. And you can find that in acquisitions all PO lines. And so a lot of these were from non-Gobi vendors. Some of them were from Gobi, certain accounts where we don't get the invoicing imported into Alma. And so I manually invoiced the FY24 POLs and I closed the rest without invoicing them. And the little picture there shows you how to do that. If you're in the all PO lines area, the drop down there, you just click closed and it goes away like magic. Next. So after all of that, I still had a bunch of items in sent. And the way I cleaned those up was to figure out that they were mostly from our DDA program, short-term loans and purchases. And I think the reason that, so they shouldn't have been there like that, but the reason why they were is because the POL was still attached to the bib, but for reasons of previous workflows, they were not attached to the portfolio that was attached to that bib. So I had to go into the portfolio, edit it, add the PO line, and then create an e-activation task and activate it. And then they moved from sent to, sorry, probably waiting for invoice. And then I did the invoices for those. Mostly I just did the purchases. I did everything from FY24, but just the purchases from pre-FY24 ones, because those were a significant amount of money. And let's see, after that, everything that was left in sent, those were actual problems to be investigated. So maybe the item had been canceled by the vendor and no one had entered that, or they were somehow not findable in the library, or they were duplicate POLs or something. And so I guess you have to think about how much time to spend investigating why an item is there and what is the value of that data, and then decide if you just want to close it or delete it, or if you do want to investigate. But I think this kind of speaks to the point of, if you track purchases well, including notes in the POL, then there's less time you need investigating mysteries. Okay, next. So then this is the data that we're leaving alone for the time being, but is maybe on the docket for later. The little graphic I have there are from alerts. I don't really know what most of those mean or why they're there. For example, not fully received. Everything is received, so I'm not really sure what that one means. I don't know if there's a lot of value in the alerts, but that's a thing that I'll be taking a look at and probably asking Ex Libris to help with the cleanup. Next. And so now that we have a nice clean acquisitions module, we want to rethink the workflows so that we don't reintroduce issues into the database. And so we developed new workflows, maybe as a reminder, based on the fact that orders are placed in Alma and sent to Gobi, and that we have auto holdings collections. So we just had to keep that in mind when we were developing new workflows. So they needed to be compatible with the Alma environment as it was intended to be used. And we wanted to find just the most efficient way to order, which you could measure in the minimal number of clicks. And then also to document inside the POL for easy access for information for communicating with patrons and staff. And I mentioned it before, but I'll say it again, legacy POLs are a great way to experiment with different things. Next. And so I thought I would just give a few little tips for when ordering ebooks and activating them. Where you do things matters. So it's best to create the POL from the CZ portfolio. That's where we order from. We search the CZ, find the portfolio that we want, and place the order there. And then once it's ready in the catalog, we activate from the task list. And one thing that's really nice about doing it there, as opposed to some other places where you could activate, is that you see the activation note. So if I need to notify someone that their ebook is ready, I have that information right there for me. And when you do things matters too. So if you activate in the task list, it gives you a confirmation message. Are you sure you want to activate this? And you say yes. And after that, you get a pop-up where Alma asks, do you want to edit it? And it is the portfolio. So at that time, you can relink it to a better record if you want to maybe there's a good NZ bib for the ebook, and that's the smoothest way to do that. And of course, you don't want to forget to go back and change the bib reference for the POL. Next. And now I will pass it back to Karen.
All right, so where are we now? So I like this sort of only a little bit messy file cabinet as an example of where we are now. As I mentioned at the top, this is all still very much a work in progress. So we still have some messiness in our data, but especially for, going forward data, we're in a lot more clean place in terms of Alma acquisitions. So most of our collections purchasing is tracked in Alma. I have recently been pulling some purchasing data from FY24 for some reports that I'm having to turn in, and I've only had to track down like a handful of invoices, which is great, much improved from previous years. Our order statuses mostly reflect actions that need to be taken. So we're receiving things or activating things in the way that Alma expects, so we can use those different statuses for workflows like Caroline was talking about. Our funds largely reflect our actual budget, so we can use them for tracking purposes. We know the boundaries of what analytics data can be trusted. So if I'm pulling anything from FY24, I know that that data is going to be in pretty good shape if I'm running an analytics report. If it's from before that, maybe it will, maybe it won't, but I have an expectation of what I can expect to see. Where all orders are prioritized to be attached to a inventory of some kind. So we're not having sort of, mysterious orders that are not attached to anything, which is something that was happening previously. So it's much easier to kind of backtrack and see, if there's a problem with the book, or we can see sort of how it was purchased. And so that was one of the things that we were hoping to get. So that's the end of our prepared comments. Are there any questions?
Feel free to put your questions in the chat or unmute yourself and ask them verbally.
Right, well, while we're waiting, thanks Caroline and Rachel for the presentation. If anybody out there has got any questions, or if you're thinking about asking a question during this presentation and want to let us know, you can put something in the chat, raise your hand, or just unmute yourself and join the conversation.
If you have a question later, you can also email lieback@ohsu.edu. That goes to all three of us. So.
Excellent. And if you don't have anything to jot that down with now, slides will be available on the site later today. All right, I'm still not seeing anything. Oh, here we go. Caroline, I'm curious about why you use records in the CZ for ebooks. We do not typically find the CZ records to be reliable. From Samantha at UI.
Yeah, for us, mostly because of the auto holdings collections. If you order the book from the NZ, then it creates a local portfolio in the IZ. And then if it's an auto holdings collection, then a second portfolio comes into the system and attaches to that. So then you have two portfolios in your bib, and one of them has the active link and the other one has the POL. And so you have to somehow combine those and delete one of them. That's what we found based on the way external systems and Alma interact. So for us, it was much easier to order from the portfolio. The bib could be terrible, but that's no problem because we know that when I activate it, I'm gonna, it offers me kind of an easy access to relinking, and I do it at that time. Was that clear or too workflowy?
Yeah, and that sort of issue with the auto holdings bringing in the second portfolio is one of the main reasons why a lot of the POLs that we had that we were using to order did not have inventory attached, even for the more recent ones.
We have another question. How are you handling orders/invoices for package orders where there might be a package of ebooks or streaming media?
Yeah, so we don't currently have any streaming media orders, but we do ebook package orders, and it depends on how they're set up in the system. So if there is a single electronic collection that we've purchased that encompasses all of that, it's an order for the electronic collection. If it's a very large set of books, obviously it's not practical to, create a technical PO line for every single book in a huge package. So what we did for those is create an order, an other service order. And then Caroline ran a job to include a note in the portfolios just to sort of note that they were part of that order. So we're able to at least record the spend to help track our finances in Alma, even though it's not attached to this. So if it's part of the larger auto holdings collection, for example, like we have some Springer packages that we buy, but we have a Springer auto holdings collection that has many different types of purchases.
All right, thanks for the questions, everyone. Anything else from the audience before we wrap up for the day, for the hour? All right, not seeing anything else with that. Karen, Caroline, Rachel, thank you again for the presentation. To all of my Alliance colleagues, thanks for joining us here for the first hour of our afternoon session of day 2 for SCTS days. We're going to take a break for about 15 minutes, and we will be back at 3 with our second and final presentation of the afternoon.